All right, class, we're going to kick off our first video lecture this semester with the basics of blood flow. As I mentioned, we're only covering 5 pages of material. It's page 466 to 470 in the textbook. Not very long, but it is pretty dense. It's kind of the principles of blood flow, how resistance and how pressure affect flow. So bear with me here, and then we'll have a chance on Friday to talk about this a bit more. Now, as we talk about cardiovascular physiology, everything is going to be centered around the heart, big, major, important organ. Everyone's familiar with. A lot of people know is a very important part of the body. But we're also going to be dealing quite a bit with the blood vessels, so the arteries, the capillaries, the veins that connect all of this. And in the end, as important as and impressive as the heart is, the cardiovascular system is really just involved in transportation. The heart pumps blood across the body. It's going to transport nutrients, signal molecules, waste, and it'll allow for excretion. So for all the important things it does, for all the importance we give it, it really is just a transportation system. Now, when we think about this transport, it's going to be dependent on blood flow. So any of these materials, any of these nutrients, any of these wastes have to be carried in the blood. And the way we're going to have this work is that the heart is going to act as a pump to push the blood through the vessels. And as it works, any sort of flow, including blood flow, is going to rely on a pressure gradient. So blood in this case is going to go from an area of high pressure at the heart to areas of lower pressure. So it's a similar idea to a concentration gradient for diffusion, although in this case we're talking specifically about fluid pressure. And if we look at this graph here, we see how blood pressure is going to change across the cardiovascular system, specifically across the blood vessels. So at the aorta, we're looking at pressures of nearly 100 millimeters of mercury. And that's going to drop as we progress towards the capillaries. We might only be around 30 to 40 millimeters of mercury. Further, it's going to drop through the venules, through the veins, and at the vena cava, we're at nearly zero pressure, nearly 0 millimeters of mercury. And this change in pressure is going to allow for blood to flow. Now, the key to this blood flow is this relationship between pressure and flow. So ultimately, blood flow is what we're interested in, but we need to know about the pressure to understand how we get there. So the blood travels from the arteries towards the veins because the pressure is high in the arteries and because it is low in the veins. So that difference in pressure allows for blood to flow from the arteries to the veins. Now, why does this pressure drop? Well, it's in part due to this resistance of the blood vessels. So we have a fluid moving through basically a pipe. And as you go through this tubing, there's friction against the vessel walls. And there's also the blood that's already in there. And that's going to slow down the blood as it leaves the heart. And it's going to drop the amount of pressure as we progress towards the veins. And if somehow this pressure differential was reversed, flow would go the opposite way. So pressure is going to determine flow. Now here we have an example from your book. It's kind of an awkward example, but if you have these system of tubes, they're going to be filled with water. The pressure of that water, or the hydrostatic pressure, is the push, the force it exerts on the walls of its container. And in this case here, it's dependent on gravity. So there's a mass to that water, and the weight of that water is basically pressing down on the container that it's holding it. It's also pressing outward. So it's a source of potential energy. The water would like to be as close to the floor as possible, as close to the ground, but it's being held up by this container, so it's going to be exerting pressure on it. Now this is in a static example. You can see we have the plug in the tubing here so that we don't have any flow because this pressure shown by these arrows is equal across the whole container. So with no difference in pressure, no pressure gradient, there's no flow. Now, if we change this example, so we remove the plug, we open the end of this container, it allows water to flow out. Now, why is that? Well, because the open end here has very low pressure. There's nothing keeping that water in the container. And as it starts to flow out, this pressure changes across the container, as you can see again by the arrows here. You'll have the highest pressure near the start here. As you can see, that's the highest column of water. The column very close to the exit here is the lowest because you have the least pressure pushing against the walls of this container, kind of keeping it up, working against gravity. It's kind of an awkward example, so we'll use some other examples. Basically, it's the same way the water tower works. So if your hometown has a water tower, basically what you have is a system where the water is held up at elevation, either in a raised tank like you'll see, or on a hillside like you'd see on the South Hill in Spokane. And basically that water wants to drop to a lower elevation. It wants to drop out of the water tower towards the ground, or it wants to run downhill and out. And the weight of that water in the tank is going to be pressing down on the water throughout these pipes. It's going to pressurize the system. So here, when you turn on your sprinklers or you turn on the faucet to brush your teeth, the water is going to come out of there because there is this pressure, there is this force of the water that's held at an elevation. Now that's great. That's all well and good. That's how gravity causes this to work. Without using gravity, we can also use a pump, in which you'll see here in the raised water tower example. Basically, we can use a pump to pressurize this water so that we ultimately have the same result. We have this force of the fluid against the container, against the fluid in that container, and that when we open up a spigot, open up a faucet, it's going to allow that water to leave the container. Now we have blood flow going through the cardiovascular system, and that's dependent on this change in pressure, this differential in pressure. So pressure is going to be created by contracting muscles. That's going to pressurize the blood at the aorta, and that's going to allow blood to flow towards the veins. Now it's this cardiac muscle of the ventricles that is creating this pressure. And then there's factors in the blood vessels that are going to change that pressure differential. So vasodilation, this opening up of the blood vessels, increase in diameter, is going to cause blood pressure to drop, which causes an increase in that pressure differential, that pressure gradient. On the other hand, vasoconstriction, or the narrowing of vessel diameter, is going to cause a rise in blood pressure. Flow will drop because you have a smaller pressure differential. And we're also going to have volume changes that affect blood pressure in the cardiovascular system. And we'll talk about this a bit now. We'll actually talk about it quite a bit more when we talk about the kidneys especially. But in a lot of cases, starting off, we're going to ignore volume changes to simplify things. Once we get the basics of the cardiovascular system down, then we'll go back and add that in later. Now, so fluid flow depends on the pressure gradient as it moves through that tube. Now, the thing here is that really it works the same way in the plumbing in your apartment as it does in your body. It also works the same way in the brakes on your car. So, flow through the tube is directly proportional to the pressure gradient. So, as the pressure gradient increases, flow is going to increase. And as you can see here in this diagram, we'll have flow moving from an area of high pressure towards an area of low pressure. And the difference in those pressures is going to be that delta P, that's going to be your gradient. Now, in this example here, we can put some specific numbers here. With a pressure at 100 millimeters mercury on both sides of this tube, there is going to be no flow. pressure is the same on both sides. There is no gradient. 100 at the start minus 100 at the finish is 0. 0 gradient equals no flow. Now in these cases, we're really most interested in the difference. We can raise both of those numbers to 1,000. It's still going to be no pressure. With no pressure differential, there will be no flow. Now, if we have examples where the pressure is higher on the one end, lower on the opposite, it's going to go then from the areas of high pressure to low pressure. And what you can see here is that in this upper example, 100 millimeters of mercury is the pressure at the start. There's a differential of 25 millimeters of mercury, resulting in a pressure of 75 at the end, indicating that that flow is going from one end to the other, and the gradient is 25 millimeters of mercury. Now, the lower example, we start out at 40 millimeters of mercury to 15 millimeters of mercury. And in this case, the gradient is the same. The pressures are much lower in the second example, but the blood flow is going to be the same. Flow is dependent on the change in pressure, not the absolute magnitude of that pressure. So we know that this pressure differential is going to drive flow. That pressure gradient is necessary for flow to move from one end to the other. And we also have resistance as our other big force. So resistance is going to be opposing our blood flow. So flow through a tube is inversely proportional to the resistance. Or as you can see here, flow is going to be proportional to 1 over R. So as resistance increases, flow decreases. From the other point of view, if resistance decreases, we'll see an increase in blood flow. And we can look at this with Poiseuille's law. Old French scientist came up with this. This nasty-looking equation applies the same to plumbing as it does to your body. Luckily for you guys, luckily for me, we're going to simplify it a little bit. But basically, let's start by looking at the R in red is resistance, and that's going to be proportional to the length of the tube. So how long is the blood vessel? And in the body, actually, how long are all of the blood vessels combined? And this just shows us that resistance will increase as length increases. Now, for our purposes, we're not going to worry about length. The length of vessels can increase, specifically with growth. But we're going to consider that to be a constant. We're also going to look at resistance being proportional to viscosity of the blood, so that the thickness of the fluid is going to affect the resistance. So as viscosity increases, as the blood thickens, resistance will also increase. Now again, we're not going to worry about this now. It does become an issue with dehydration. But for our purposes at this point, we're going to ignore viscosity as a factor in resistance. We're just going to simplify things for the time being so we get the principles down. Now the big one for us to think about is that resistance is inversely proportional to tube radius. So the R in orange here, that's under the division sign. So that means as tube radius increases, resistance is going to decrease, and vice versa. If the radius of that tube decreases, resistance will increase as a result. Now here, I've rewritten this. Basically what we're doing here is we're going to take out the constants. So we have 8 in there, we have pi in there. If we divide those out, it works out to be about 2.5. But really, we're not interested in the specific numbers. We're interested in the relationship. So we want to know if there's a change in radius, what is the magnitude of change we see in resistance? So really, this equation on the right, circled in red here, is going to be the one we're really going to focus on. And to be honest, we can even simplify it more. So if we assume that the length of the tube, the length of these blood vessels really doesn't change or only changes minimally, we can ignore that factor. Same with viscosity in green here. So if we assume that blood viscosity is not going to change, we can basically come away with this idea that resistance is going to be affected basically only by the change in radius. So here we want to look at an example where we have this container of water. We have two tubes draining that container. Tube A has a radius of 1. Tube B has a radius of 2. So we increase the diameter of tube B. It's going to decrease the resistance. When we decrease the resistance, we are then going to increase the flow. So let's take a minute and talk about some of the math involved here. Now, resistance, we can boil this down to being proportional to 1 over the radius raised to the 4th power. And that's what we saw in the previous slide here. So we do have a couple constants, the 8 and the pi. Those can just be ignored. And we'll also ignore the length and the viscosity because in this case, the length of the tubes is the same. It's also the same liquid going through those tubes, so there's going to be no differences there. Also keep in mind that because radius is raised to the 4th, it's going to have the greatest effect on resistance, much greater effect than any of the other factors we deal with. So here in the purple box here, looking at resistance, we're only going to take into account the radius. And because that radius is raised to the 4th, it's going to have a dramatic effect. So when we have the radius of tube A is 1, 1 raised to the 4th power is still 1. And then 1 over 1 is obviously going to be 1. So our resistance is going to be given a value of 1 in this case. In tube B, if we double the radius to a value of 2, 2 raised to the 4th is going to give us 16. So the resistance in tube B is 1 over 16. It is in fact only 1/16 of the resistance that we find in tube A, despite the change in the diameter only being double. It's a 16-fold change in resistance. So if we look at flow, we know that flow is 1 over the resistance. So if we look at the resistance being 1 in tube A, 1 over 1 gives you a flow value of 1. A lot of 1s in that statement. Compare that to tube B. The resistance is only 1/16 as it is in tube A. 1 over 1/16 is going to give us a flow value of 16. So again, we've doubled the radius of this piece of tubing, but we've increased the flow by a factor of 16. So the radius is going to have a tremendous effect on the resistance. It is also then going to have a tremendous effect on the flow. All right, so hopefully you're appreciating the fact that resistance is going to oppose flow. These forces are working against each other, and that just a small change in radius is going to have a very large effect on resistance due to that factor being raised to the 4th power. And as we'll see with vasoconstriction, it reduces the radius of the blood vessel, and it is going to, in effect, reduce blood flow. On the other hand, with vasodilation, the vessel opens up, the vessel radius increases, and as a result, blood flow increases. Like we said before, so flow is going to be proportional to the pressure gradient divided by the resistance. So we're just putting together our two concepts here. So flow is basically equivalent to delta P over R. The change in pressure from one end of the tube to the other divided by the resistance of that tube. So here, put this all together, we have flow is represented by Q here. Q is going to be equal to delta P, so that is our change in pressure, and then we're just adding our factor for resistance. So 1 over resistance here is going to be just the opposite of the equation you saw before. Resistance is 8 times the length times the viscosity divided by pi and the radius to the fourth. Because it's inversely proportional, we're going to flip that over when we're calculating flow. And that works out to be that flow is equal to delta P times the radius to the fourth divided by the length times the viscosity. And we want to take a minute to talk about flow and flow rate versus velocity. Here we run into some troubles because we're really not very interested in what the speed of blood movement through the vessels. That's what velocity would be. What we're interested in is flow rate, how much fluid gets to the tissues over the course of a minute. Basically what this is showing you is that as the vessel increases in diameter, the speed of blood movement is going to slow down. We have a situation here where, because there's so much more fluid that can fit into the larger vessel, it doesn't have to move as fast to get to the end at the same flow rate. So here, if we're looking at 12 cubic centimeters, in the small, narrower vessel, it's going to take up a greater length than that vessel. Basically, because that cross-sectional area is smaller, it's going to have to be longer to get that same volume. Now, as the blood vessel opens up, you can see the slice is much narrower because there's a larger cross-sectional area to accommodate that fluid. So here, basically, flow rate is just how much fluid passes a given point in a minute. So if our flow rate is 12 cubic centimeters per minute, here you only have a velocity of 1 centimeter per minute to get the required flow rate. In the smaller vessel, it's going to have to go 12 times as fast because of that decreased radius. Now, it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but keep in mind that what we're really interested in is flow rate. How much blood is getting to the capillaries per minute? The speed is important. It's related, but that's not the variable we're really interested in. And we'll talk about this a bit more, but here we can look at the example of a couple rivers here. Basically, if we talk about flow versus velocity, if velocity is the same, so if the water is moving past a certain point in both of these rivers, how is the flow going to compare? And I want you to think about these as you're listening here before you come to class, and we'll talk about them when we get to class. But we can also turn that question around so that what if the flow is the same in both of these rivers? So a certain volume of water passes a point in the course of a minute or an hour or any time unit you choose. How is the velocity of the water in that river going to change or be the same? How does it compare? And on a final thought, on page 470, there are a couple good concept check questions. You can see the answers are provided to you at the end of the chapter. But hopefully you take a minute to look at those. I think they're pretty good, quick check of how well you get the information. And again, I won't talk about them right now, but we'll talk about them in class. I think it's a good opportunity to kind of test yourself. And then I'll ask you about it on Friday, and we'll see how we're doing with that. And again, remember, it's not the easiest material. It's only 5 pages, so it's pretty quick, but I want to really be sure that we have it, we cover it, because it'll make life a whole lot easier as we move along through the semester. So read through those 5 pages, take your notes, make note of any questions you have, and we'll talk more about this on Friday. Thank you.